The candlelight flickers across ancient parchment as trembling fingers trace words that should never have been written. In a dusty corner of a forgotten library, a leather-bound tome sits wrapped in chains, its very presence seeming to whisper promises of knowledge too terrible for mortal minds. The brass clasps are tarnished with age, and strange symbols etched into the cover seem to shift and writhe in the dancing shadows. This is no ordinary book. This is the Necronomicon. But here's the fascinating truth. This book has never existed. Yet somehow, this imaginary tome has become one of the most famous and feared books in human history. Libraries receive requests for it weekly. Occult shops claim to sell copies. Scholars debate its contents. And late at night, in dimly lit rooms around the world, people still search for a book that was born purely from the imagination. Tonight on Midnight Deep Dive, we're exploring the strange and wonderful story of literature's most infamous fictional book. How a work of pure imagination became so convincing that it escaped the boundaries of fiction to become a cultural phenomenon that spans decades, continents, and belief systems. So settle in, close your eyes, and let yourself drift peacefully as we uncover the story of the book that never was, yet somehow always is. Howard Phillips Lovecraft lived most of his life in a world of shadows and whispered fears. Confined largely to the narrow streets of Providence, Rhode Island, where he was born on August 20, 1890. Picture a pale, gaunt figure hunched over a writing desk in the early hours of morning, his angular face illuminated only by the weak glow of a desk lamp, as he crafted tales of cosmic terror that would outlive him by decades. Lovecraft was a man haunted by dreams. Not the pleasant sort that visit us in peaceful sleep, but the kind of dreams that blur the line between imagination and nightmare, between possible and impossible. The Providence of Lovecraft's time was a city caught between eras. Ancient colonial architecture stood alongside newer industrial buildings, creating a landscape that felt simultaneously familiar and alien, much like the fictional worlds Lovecraft would create. He would take long, solitary walks through the city's oldest neighborhoods, particularly drawn to the areas around Benefit Street, where 18th-century houses leaned inward over narrow cobblestone paths like conspirators sharing ancient secrets. These nocturnal wanderings through Providence's historic districts profoundly influenced Lovecraft's literary imagination. The weathered headstones in the old cemeteries, with their skull and crossbones motifs and barely legible inscriptions, spoke to him of mortality and forgotten knowledge. The colonial mansions, with their hidden passages and mysterious histories, suggested the kind of ancestral secrets that would populate his stories. Even the industrial areas, with their strange machinery and unfamiliar sounds, contributed to his sense that the modern world concealed older, more sinister truths. Lovecraft's fascination with forbidden knowledge didn't emerge from nowhere. It grew from his voracious appetite for learning and his deep sense of cosmic insignificance. As a child, he was extraordinarily precocious, reading extensively in astronomy, chemistry, and ancient history. By age 8, he was writing his own versions of classical myths. By his teens, he was corresponding with astronomers and publishing articles in amateur journals. Yet this vast learning seemed only to increase his sense of humanity's smallness in an indifferent universe. The astronomical knowledge that Lovecraft absorbed during his youth particularly shaped his worldview. Through his telescope, he observed distant stars and planets, developing an acute awareness of the vast scales of space and time that dwarf human existence. This cosmic perspective would become central to his fiction. The idea that humanity's concerns are utterly insignificant when viewed against the backdrop of an infinite universe filled with forces beyond our comprehension. Lovecraft's personal struggles with social anxiety and chronic illness also influenced his literary approach to forbidden knowledge. Largely isolated from mainstream society, he found solace in books and correspondence with fellow writers. This isolation allowed him to develop a unique literary voice, but it also fed into his fiction's themes of characters who discover terrible truths that separate them forever from ordinary human society. The concept of dangerous knowledge appears throughout human mythology and literature, from Prometheus stealing fire from the gods to the biblical tree of knowledge of good and evil. Lovecraft understood this archetypal fear and transformed it into something distinctly modern. Rather than divine punishment for transgression, his stories suggested that some knowledge is dangerous simply because reality itself is too terrible for human minds to comprehend. When Lovecraft began writing professionally in the 1920s, he was creating fiction for pulp magazines like Weird Tales, publications that catered to readers hungry for stories of horror, mystery, and the supernatural. But Lovecraft's approach differed significantly from his contemporaries. While other horror writers focused on traditional monsters, vampires, werewolves, ghosts, Lovecraft imagined horrors that were fundamentally alien and incomprehensible. His early stories experimented with different approaches to cosmic horror, but they all shared certain characteristics. Protagonists who uncover knowledge that destroys their sanity, ancient forces that exist beyond human understanding, and the suggestion that our entire understanding of reality is fatally incomplete. These stories were building towards something, a unified mythology that would culminate in his creation of the most famous fictional book in literary history. The literary influences that shaped Lovecraft's approach to forbidden knowledge were diverse and sophisticated. He admired the psychological horror of Edgar Allan Poe, the cosmic speculation of William Hope Hodgson, and the antiquarian atmosphere of M.R. James, but perhaps more importantly, he was influenced by his reading in anthropology, archaeology, and comparative mythology, which gave him a framework for imagining how ancient knowledge might persist into the modern world. Lovecraft's correspondence with other writers was crucial to the development of his mythology. Through letters with contemporaries like Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, and August Derleth, he developed and refined his ideas about cosmic horror. These friendships provided both creative stimulation and emotional support for a writer who often felt disconnected from the world around him. Long before Lovecraft imagined his fictional Necronomicon, humanity had already created a rich tradition of books supposedly containing dangerous knowledge. Throughout history, certain texts have been whispered about in shadows, banned by authorities, and sought after by those willing to risk their souls for forbidden wisdom. These real grimoires, occult treatises, and suppressed manuscripts provided the template that Lovecraft would use to create his fictional masterpiece. Consider the Picatrix, a medieval grimoire that claimed to contain the secrets of astral magic and communication with planetary spirits. This 1,000-page Latin manuscript, translated from Arabic sources, promised readers the ability to create talismans of incredible power, to influence the thoughts and actions of others, and to commune with entities from beyond the physical world. The text was considered so dangerous that it was banned by the Catholic Church, and survived only in hidden copies passed down through generations of occultists. The Key of Solomon, attributed to the biblical King Solomon himself, represents another tradition of forbidden magical knowledge. This grimoire claimed to contain the methods by which Solomon bound demons to his will and built his temple through supernatural means. The text includes elaborate rituals for summoning and controlling various types of spirits, complete with detailed drawings of magical circles, arcane symbols, and the specific words of power needed to compel otherworldly entities to serve human will. Medieval Islamic scholarship produced its own tradition of dangerous books, including works attributed to Jabir ibn Hayyan, the 8th century alchemist known in the West as Geber. These texts promise to reveal the secrets of transmutation, not just the transformation of base metals into gold, but the fundamental principles underlying all change and transformation in the natural world. Such knowledge was considered dangerous because it suggested that the natural order established by divine will could be manipulated by human understanding. The sworn Book of Honorius, dating from the 13th century, claimed to be a condensation of all magical knowledge, compiled by a council of 811 masters of magic from around the world. According to its prologue, the Church had become so concerned about the proliferation of magical knowledge that these masters agreed to preserve only the most essential teachings in a single volume. The book promised its readers the ability to obtain visions of God, to compel spirits to reveal hidden treasures, and to gain knowledge of events happening in distant places. Jewish mystical traditions contributed their own forbidden texts, particularly the various books of Enoch, which claimed to record the fallen angels' teachings to humanity before the Great Flood. These texts described the forbidden knowledge that corrupted the antediluvian world: astronomy and astrology, the secrets of metalworking and cosmetics, the arts of war and sorcery. The implication was that some knowledge was too dangerous for humanity to possess, that it had literally brought about the destruction of the world. The Renaissance period saw an explosion of interest in occult texts, as scholars like Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, John Dee, and Giordano Bruno attempted to reconcile classical magic with Christian theology and emerging natural philosophy. Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy represented the most comprehensive attempt to systematize magical knowledge, covering everything from numerology and astrology to angel magic and the Kabbalah. These works were controversial precisely because they claimed that magical knowledge could be pursued as a form of natural philosophy rather than diabolic transgression. John Dee's Enochian magical system, developed through his communications with angels via a crystal ball and the mediumship of Edward Kelly, produced texts written in what Dee believed was the language spoken by angels and used by God in the creation of the world. The complexity and apparent consistency of this angelic language convinced many that Dee had indeed made contact with otherworldly intelligence, while others suspected elaborate fraud, or, more dangerously, genuine diabolic deception. The witch trial period of the 16th and 17th centuries generated its own literature of dangerous knowledge, including the Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, which claimed to provide complete instructions for identifying, prosecuting, and executing practitioners of harmful magic. While ostensibly written to combat witchcraft, the books detailed descriptions of magical practices effectively served as a manual for those interested in learning such techniques. Alchemical texts presented another category of forbidden knowledge, promising not only material transmutation, but spiritual transformation. Works like The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz and various texts attributed to Nicholas Flamel claimed to contain the secrets of creating the Philosopher's Stone, a substance that could transmute metals, cure diseases, and extend human life indefinitely. The danger of such knowledge lay not only in its potential for abuse, but in its suggestion that human beings could achieve divine powers through understanding natural principles. The 18th and 19th centuries saw the emergence of new forms of occult literature, including the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg, who claimed to have visited heaven and hell and conversed with angels and demons. Swedenborg's detailed descriptions of the spiritual world were accepted by many as genuine revelation, creating a new tradition of mystical literature that influenced everyone from the poet William Blake to the philosophers Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry James, Sr. The Romantic period's fascination with the Gothic and supernatural produced literary works that blurred the line between fiction and genuine magical practice. Gothic novels often featured mysterious manuscripts and forbidden books as plot devices, but some readers began to take these fictional grimoires seriously, leading to the creation of actual magical traditions based on literary inventions. By Lovecraft's time, The tradition of forbidden books had evolved to include not only religious and magical texts, but also scientific and philosophical works that challenged conventional understanding of reality. Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic writings, and Einstein's theories of relativity all represented forms of knowledge that some considered dangerous to traditional beliefs and social order. This rich historical tradition of forbidden knowledge provided Lovecraft with a template for creating his own fictional grimoire. He understood that the most convincing forbidden books combined several elements: ancient authorship lending them authority, dangerous knowledge that justified their suppression, and enough concrete detail to make them seem plausible to readers already familiar with the tradition of occult literature. The first whisper of the Necronomicon appeared in Lovecraft's 1924 short story, The Hound, mentioned almost casually as one of several forbidden texts consulted by the story's protagonists. But it was in The Call of Cthulhu, written in 1926, that Lovecraft began to develop the book's mythology in earnest. Picture him in his cramped study, surrounded by stacks of books on archaeology, anthropology, and comparative mythology, carefully constructing a fictional history that would feel authentic to readers already familiar with real occult traditions. Lovecraft's genius lay in his attention to detail. Rather than simply inventing a generic book of evil, he created a complete bibliographic history for his imaginary tome. The Necronomicon, he explained, was written in Damascus around 730 AD by Abdul-Hazred, whom he described as the Mad Arab. The original Arabic title was Al-Azif, a word Lovecraft claimed referred to the howling of demons, though he likely derived it from the Arabic word for the chirping of insects at night, a sound he would have heard during his own nocturnal wanderings. According to Lovecraft's fictional history, the book was translated into Greek in 950 AD by Theodorus Philtas of Constantinople, who gave it the title Necronomicon, literally Book of the Laws of the Dead. This Greek version was supposedly translated into Latin by Olaus Wormius in 1228, creating the version that would become most widely known in European occult circles. Each translation, Lovecraft suggested, introduced new errors and distortions, making the surviving versions unreliable guides to the original text's true meaning. The book's supposed contents reflected Lovecraft's deep reading in anthropology and comparative mythology. The Necronomicon, he claimed, contained detailed information about the Old Ones, ancient cosmic entities that ruled the earth before humanity evolved, and that wait in hidden places for the opportunity to reclaim their dominion. The book provided genealogies of these entities, descriptions of their attributes and domains, and most dangerously, the rituals and incantations needed to communicate with them or summon them back to active influence in the world. Lovecraft embedded references to the Necronomicon throughout his fiction, creating a sense that multiple independent sources confirmed its existence and importance. In The Dunwich Horror, the wizard Wilbur Whateley uses the Necronomicon to attempt summoning his otherworldly father. In The Whisperer in Darkness, scholars debate the book's authenticity while unknowingly becoming involved with the very entities it describes. In At the Mountains of Madness, Antarctic explorers discover evidence that corroborates the book's account of prehistoric civilizations. The fictional author Abdul-Hazred became almost as famous as his supposed book. Lovecraft described him as a poet and scholar who spent years wandering the empty quarters of Arabia, where he encountered the ruins of ancient civilizations and made contact with entities that drove him mad, but also gave him terrible knowledge. Al-Hazred supposedly spent his final years in Damascus, setting down everything he had learned in the book that would become his legacy. According to Lovecraft's fictional chronology, Al-Hazred died horribly in 738 AD, torn apart in broad daylight by invisible forces while walking through a Damascus marketplace. Lovecraft carefully constructed a history of the book's suppression and survival that paralleled the real history of banned texts. He claimed that the original Arabic version had been lost, that the Greek translation was burned by Patriarch Michael in 1050, and that the Latin version was placed on the papal index of forbidden books in 1232. Only a few copies were said to survive in the most restricted sections of the world's greatest libraries: the British Museum, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, the Widener Library at Harvard, the University of Buenos Aires, and Miskatonic University in the fictional Massachusetts town of Arkham. The supposed rarity and danger of the Necronomicon made it all the more appealing to Lovecraft's readers. He described it as a book that could be consulted only by the most determined scholars, and only at great personal risk. Those who read it too deeply were said to suffer nightmares, hallucinations, and eventual madness. Some supposedly vanished entirely, presumably claimed by the very entities whose attention the book attracted. Lovecraft's correspondence with other writers helped develop and refine the Necronomicon's mythology. Fellow authors like Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, and August Derleth began incorporating references to the book into their own stories, creating a sense of shared fictional reality that made the mythology more convincing. This collaborative world-building was unusual for the time and helped establish what would later be called the Cthulhu mythos, a shared universe of cosmic horror centered around the entities described in the Necronomicon. The book's supposed contents reflected Lovecraft's philosophical materialism and his rejection of anthropocentric worldviews. Unlike traditional grimoires that promised power to human practitioners, the Necronomicon suggested that humanity was utterly insignificant in cosmic terms. The entities it described were not demons who could be bargained with or angels who might show mercy. They were alien intelligences for whom humanity was at best irrelevant and at worst a minor nuisance to be eliminated. Lovecraft's description of the book's physical appearance varied from story to story, but certain details remained constant. It was usually described as a large, leather-bound volume with brass clasps and corners. The binding was often described as being made from an unidentifiable material that felt unpleasantly warm to the touch. The text was written in various languages and scripts, some of which were entirely unknown to human scholarship. Diagrams and illustrations accompanied the text, showing the physical forms of various entities and the geometric patterns used in summoning rituals. The Necronomicon's most famous passage, quoted in several of Lovecraft's stories, became an iconic representation of cosmic horror. "That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die." This couplet perfectly captured the book's central theme. That conventional human understanding of life, death, and reality itself was fundamentally inadequate to comprehend the true nature of existence. Lovecraft's creation was so convincing that it began to take on a life of its own even during his lifetime. Readers wrote to him, asking where they could obtain copies of the book. Scholars inquired about its historical authenticity. Occultists began incorporating its mythology into their own practices. The boundary between fiction and reality began to blur, exactly as Lovecraft had intended when he constructed his elaborate fictional history with such meticulous attention to detail. Something extraordinary began happening in the years following Lovecraft's death in 1937. His fictional Necronomicon started becoming real. Not in any supernatural sense, but in the very human sense that enough people began treating it as authentic that it began to acquire the cultural weight and influence of an actual historical text. This transformation from pure fiction to cultural artifact represents one of the most fascinating examples of how imaginary things can shape reality through the simple power of collective belief. The process began gradually, almost imperceptibly. In the 1940s and 1950s, References to the Necronomicon appeared in scholarly works on folklore and comparative mythology, often without clear indication that the book was fictional. Well-meaning academics, encountering Lovecraft's detailed citations and cross-references, assumed they were dealing with a genuine historical text that happened to be extremely rare or well hidden. Libraries began receiving serious inquiries about the book's availability, and some librarians, unfamiliar with Lovecraft's work, spent considerable time searching their catalogs and corresponding with other institutions about this mysterious Arabic manuscript. August Derleth, Lovecraft's literary executor and the founder of Arkham House Publishing, played a crucial role in this transformation. While Derleth worked tirelessly to preserve and promote Lovecraft's literary legacy, his own interpretations of the Cthulhu mythos sometimes blurred the line between fictional creation and scholarly commentary. Derleth's systematic approach to cataloging and cross-referencing the various entities and texts mentioned in Lovecraft's stories gave the mythology an academic veneer that made it seem more historically grounded than Lovecraft himself had ever intended. The 1960s counterculture movement provided fertile ground for the Necronomicon's transformation from fiction to legend. Young people questioning established authorities and exploring alternative spiritualities were naturally drawn to forbidden knowledge and suppressed texts. Many had encountered Lovecraft's stories in paperback collections that didn't always clearly identify them as fiction, leading some readers to assume they were dealing with genuine historical accounts of ancient mysteries. College campuses became particularly important sites for the Necronomicon's cultural evolution. Students discovering Lovecraft's work often took his scholarly apparatus at face value, especially when encountering stories in academic contexts where fiction and nonfiction were sometimes presented without clear distinction. The book's supposed connection to Harvard's Widener Library was particularly compelling for students at that institution, leading to persistent rumors that a copy was indeed hidden somewhere in the library's restricted collections. The rise of occult and New Age bookshops in the 1960s and 1970s created new venues for the Necronomicon's quasi-historical status. Shop owners, responding to customer demand, began stocking books about Lovecraft's mythology alongside genuine historical occult texts. The boundaries between fiction, historical reconstruction, and active magical practice became increasingly blurred as different communities appropriated Lovecraft's creations for their own purposes. Fan communities played a crucial role in developing the Necronomicon's pseudo-historical status. Science fiction and fantasy conventions provided gathering places where enthusiasts could share research and speculation about Lovecraft's sources and inspirations. Some fans began serious scholarly investigations into the historical parallels for Lovecraft's fictional entities, creating detailed comparisons between the Cthulhu mythos and genuine ancient mythologies. While these investigations usually began with clear understanding that they were dealing with fiction, the line between literary analysis and historical research sometimes became blurred. The publication of scholarly books about Lovecraft's work further contributed to the Necronomicon's cultural authenticity. Academic studies that carefully analyzed Lovecraft's sources and influences sometimes presented his fictional creations alongside genuine historical material in ways that made the distinction unclear to casual readers. The very existence of serious scholarly attention seemed to confirm that the Necronomicon was worthy of the same consideration given to actual historical texts. International translation of Lovecraft's work spread the Necronomicon's influence to cultures unfamiliar with American pulp fiction traditions. In some cases, translators and publishers presented Lovecraft's stories without adequate context about their fictional nature, leading readers to encounter the Necronomicon as though it were a genuine historical curiosity rather than a literary creation. This was particularly common in countries where Lovecraft's work was published in academic or literary contexts rather than as genre fiction. The development of role-playing games in the 1970s and 1980s provided new platforms for treating the Necronomicon as a functional magical text. Games like Call of Cthulhu encouraged players to immerse themselves in Lovecraft's fictional universe, complete with detailed rules for using the Necronomicon and other grimoires as game elements. For many players, the line between gaming and genuine occult practice became blurred, especially as some game materials were written with impressive attention to historical detail and authenticity. Urban legends began to accumulate around the Necronomicon, claiming that various individuals had encountered genuine copies of the book or had suffered supernatural consequences from attempting to read it. These stories usually followed familiar patterns. A scholar discovers a mysterious manuscript in a library's restricted collection, begins translating it despite warnings from colleagues, and gradually succumbs to madness or disappears entirely. Such tales were indistinguishable from the plots of Lovecraft's own stories, but they were often told and received as genuine accounts of real events. The book's growing cultural presence created a feedback loop that increased its apparent authenticity. As more people discussed the Necronomicon as though it were real, it became easier for newcomers to assume that it actually was real. References accumulated in popular culture, scholarly works, and occult literature, until the book achieved a kind of cultural reality that existed independently of its fictional origins. Library staff began reporting regular inquiries about the Necronomicon, leading some institutions to prepare standard responses explaining the book's fictional nature. However, these explanations were sometimes interpreted by persistent inquirers as evidence of a cover-up rather than clarification of the book's true status. The very act of denial seemed to confirm, for some believers, that the book was real but suppressed by authorities fearful of its dangerous contents. By the 1970s, the Necronomicon had achieved sufficient cultural reality that entrepreneurs began to see commercial opportunities in creating actual books to satisfy demand for this fictional text. This marked the beginning of the next phase in the book's evolution, the transformation from fictional reference to actual published work. To understand why the Necronomicon captured imaginations so powerfully, we must delve into what Lovecraft claimed the book actually contained. This wasn't merely a collection of spells and incantations like traditional grimoires, but rather a comprehensive cosmological treatise that challenged every assumption humans hold about their place in the universe. Picture opening this forbidden tome and discovering that everything you believed about reality, history, and humanity's significance was not just wrong, but laughably, tragically incomplete. According to Lovecraft's descriptions scattered throughout his stories, the Necronomicon began with Abdul-Hazred's account of his wanderings through the empty quarter of Arabia, where he encountered ruins of civilizations that predated human history by millions of years. These weren't the familiar ancient cultures of Mesopotamia or Egypt, but something far older and utterly alien. Cities built by entities whose very existence challenged the notion that Earth had ever truly belonged to humanity. The book's early chapters supposedly documented Alhazred's discovery of the Great Old Ones, cosmic entities of unimaginable power and alien intelligence who had ruled the Earth when it was young. These beings weren't gods in any human sense, requiring neither worship nor offering moral guidance. They were simply vast intelligences whose purposes and methods were as incomprehensible to humans as human concerns would be to bacteria. Cthulhu, sleeping in the sunken city of Arlai, was described as merely one of these entities, a high priest among powers so great that even he was subordinate to greater forces. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Necronomicon's supposed contents was its treatment of human history. Traditional creation, myths place humanity at the center of cosmic purpose, but Alhazred's account suggested that humans were accidental latecomers to a planet that had already witnessed the rise and fall of multiple non-human civilizations. The book allegedly contained genealogies of entities that had ruled the earth for eons before the first human appeared, making humanity's entire existence seem like a brief afterthought in cosmic history. The astronomical sections of the Necronomicon reflected Lovecraft's own deep knowledge of astronomy and his sense of cosmic scale. The book supposedly described the true structure of the universe, revealing that what humans could observe was merely a tiny, insignificant portion of a vast reality filled with inhabited worlds and traveling entities. Stars were described not as distant suns, but as way stations for beings that moved between worlds as easily as humans travel between cities. Temporal mechanics formed another crucial component of the book's alleged contents. The Necronomicon supposedly explained that time itself worked differently than humans understood, that past, present, and future were merely convenient illusions created by limited human perception. The famous couplet, "That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die," hinted at this nonlinear understanding of time, suggesting that entities could exist outside temporal sequences in ways that made concepts like dead and alive meaningless. The practical magical sections of the book were perhaps its most dangerous components. Unlike traditional grimoires that offered power and knowledge to human practitioners, the Necronomicon's rituals were described as fundamentally hazardous to human sanity and survival. The book allegedly contained complete instructions for summoning various entities, but with the clear implication that successful contact would be catastrophic for the summoner. These weren't spells for gaining power, but rather methods for attracting the attention of forces that regarded humanity as we might regard insects. Geographical sections of the book supposedly described hidden locations around the world where the influence of the Old Ones remained strong. These places, Lang, Arlai, the nameless city Kadeth, existed partially outside normal space and time, accessible only to those with specific knowledge and preparation. The book allegedly provided detailed directions to these locations, along with warnings about the dangers of visiting them. The linguistic components of the Necronomicon were particularly fascinating to Lovecraft's readers. The book supposedly contained examples of pre-human languages, including the tongue spoken by the Old Ones themselves. Phrases like Phnglui Mglwnaf Cthulhu Arlai W Gonagal Fhtan. In his house at Arlai, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming, suggested languages based on phonetic principles entirely alien to human speech. The book allegedly provided pronunciation guides and grammatical structures for these languages, making communication with non-human entities theoretically possible. Prophetic sections of the Necronomicon dealt with humanity's future, or rather its lack thereof. The book supposedly predicted the eventual return of the Old Ones and the end of human civilization as we know it. These prophecies weren't presented as inevitable doom, but rather as natural cycles. The universe returning to its proper configuration after the temporary aberration of human dominance. The book allegedly described signs and portents that would herald this transformation, many of which seemed to be manifesting in the modern world. Anatomical and biological sections supposedly documented the physical forms and capabilities of various non-human entities. These descriptions went far beyond simple monster cataloging, providing detailed analysis of alien physiologies and reproductive methods. The book allegedly explained how some entities could take human form when necessary, how others existed as pure consciousness without physical bodies, and how still others could manipulate matter and energy in ways that violated known physical laws. The most terrifying aspect of the Necronomicon's supposed contents was its treatment of human consciousness and sanity. The book allegedly explained that human minds were simply not equipped to process certain types of knowledge or experience. Reading too deeply in the book or successfully performing its rituals would inevitably result in madness. not as punishment for transgression, but as the natural consequence of forcing limited human consciousness to confront unlimited cosmic reality. Mathematical sections of the book supposedly provided geometric and numerical principles that governed interactions between dimensions and realities. These weren't earthly mathematics, but rather cosmic principles that could be used to navigate between worlds or to understand the true structure of space and time. The book allegedly contained diagrams and formulae that hurt to look at directly, as they represented spatial relationships that human vision couldn't properly process. What made these supposed contents so compelling was their internal consistency and their alignment with Lovecraft's broader philosophical concerns. The Necronomicon wasn't described as a collection of random supernatural knowledge, but rather as a systematic attempt to document an alien cosmology that was vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent to human welfare. This cosmic indifference, rather than active malevolence, made the book's vision particularly unsettling and memorable. The human fascination with forbidden knowledge runs deeper than curiosity. It touches something fundamental about our relationship with power, mortality, and the unknown. Across every culture and throughout all recorded history, humans have created stories, myths, and beliefs about dangerous information that should not be sought, books that should not be read, and truths that should not be spoken. The Necronomicon's power lies in how perfectly it embodies this universal archetype, tapping into fears and desires that transcend cultural boundaries. Consider the earliest recorded stories of humanity's relationship with forbidden knowledge. In Mesopotamian mythology, the Epic of Gilgamesh explores themes of mortality and the dangerous pursuit of immortality. Gilgamesh's quest for eternal life leads him to forbidden realms and dangerous knowledge, ultimately teaching him that some truths are too terrible for mortals to bear. The plant of youth that he briefly obtains is stolen by a serpent, suggesting that immortality was never meant for human possession. The biblical account of the Tree of Knowledge represents perhaps the most influential forbidden knowledge narrative in Western culture. Adam and Eve's consumption of the forbidden fruit doesn't grant them evil powers or demonic abilities. Instead, it gives them knowledge of good and evil, the kind of moral awareness that separates them from innocent animals, but also from divine simplicity. This knowledge comes with a terrible price: awareness of mortality, shame, and the burden of moral choice. The punishment for seeking forbidden knowledge isn't arbitrary divine anger, but the natural consequence of consciousness expanding beyond its original limitations. Greek mythology is filled with cautionary tales about the dangers of excessive knowledge. Prometheus's theft of fire represents knowledge gained for humanity's benefit, but at enormous personal cost. Pandora's box contains not treasures, but troubles that, once released, can never be contained again. Icarus's flight toward the sun symbolizes the dangerous human tendency to push beyond natural limitations. These stories consistently suggest that some knowledge comes with prices too high for mortals to pay. The Islamic tradition of forbidden knowledge centers around the story of Harut and Marut, two angels who were sent to Earth to test humanity, but ended up teaching humans magic and thereby corrupting them. This story explores the idea that knowledge itself isn't evil, but that some forms of knowledge are too powerful for human nature to handle responsibly. The angels are punished not for evil intentions, but for failing to understand the limitations of human character. Medieval European culture developed elaborate theories about different types of forbidden knowledge. Natural magic, understanding the hidden properties of herbs, stones, and astronomical influences, was generally considered acceptable. Demonic magic, gaining power through pacts with evil spirits, was absolutely forbidden. But there was also a third category, knowledge so powerful that it blurred the line between human and divine capabilities. This type of knowledge was considered dangerous not because it was evil, but because it represented a form of pride and ambition that inevitably led to corruption. The Renaissance period saw renewed interest in recovering ancient knowledge that had been lost or suppressed. Scholars like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola argued that certain forms of ancient wisdom had been deliberately hidden from the masses, but could be safely studied by learned men of virtue. This period produced numerous attempts to reconcile classical magic with Christian theology, leading to sophisticated theories about how forbidden knowledge might be pursued without spiritual danger. The scientific revolution created new categories of forbidden knowledge, as empirical investigation began challenging religious and philosophical assumptions about the nature of reality. Galileo's observations of Jupiter's moons weren't just scientific discoveries. They represented forbidden knowledge that contradicted established religious cosmology. The initial resistance to scientific discoveries often framed them as dangerous knowledge that threatened social and spiritual order. The Enlightenment brought both celebration and anxiety about the expansion of human knowledge. Voltaire and other philosophers celebrated reason and empirical investigation, but others worried about the social consequences of undermining traditional beliefs. The French Encyclopedia Project represented an ambitious attempt to collect and disseminate all human knowledge, but it also provoked fears about what might happen when dangerous information became widely available. The Romantic period developed a more ambivalent relationship with forbidden knowledge, exemplified by Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Victor Frankenstein's creation of artificial life represents the ultimate forbidden knowledge, the secret of life itself. But Shelley's novel suggests that the real danger lies not in the knowledge itself, but in the moral and emotional inadequacy of those who possess it. Frankenstein's monster becomes destructive not because it's inherently evil, but because its creator lacks the wisdom and compassion necessary to handle such tremendous responsibility. Gothic literature of the 18th and 19th centuries made forbidden knowledge a central theme, with countless novels featuring mysterious manuscripts, ancient curses, and dangerous secrets passed down through generations. These stories reflected contemporary anxieties about the rapid pace of social and technological change, using supernatural elements to explore fears about what might be lost or unleashed as traditional forms of knowledge and authority were challenged. The Victorian period's fascination with spiritualism and the occult represented another form of forbidden knowledge pursuit. Seances, mediums, and attempts to communicate with the dead weren't just entertainment. They represented serious attempts to gain knowledge that conventional religion and science insisted was impossible or dangerous. The popularity of spiritualism reflected both skepticism about traditional religious authority and anxiety about the increasingly materialistic worldview promoted by scientific progress. Anthropological discoveries of the 19th century created new categories of forbidden knowledge, as European scholars encountered belief systems and practices that challenged Western assumptions about civilization and progress. The study of primitive religions revealed sophisticated cosmologies and magical practices that some scholars found intellectually fascinating and others considered spiritually dangerous. This period saw the emergence of comparative religion and anthropology as academic disciplines, but also increased interest in occult practices derived from non-Western traditions. The 20th century brought unprecedented awareness of the potential dangers of scientific knowledge. The development of nuclear weapons represented the ultimate forbidden knowledge, information so dangerous that its very existence threatened human survival. Unlike mythological forbidden knowledge that threatened individual souls or small communities, nuclear science created the possibility of species-wide destruction. This shifted discussions of forbidden knowledge from primarily religious and moral contexts to practical questions of survival and responsibility. Psychological theories developed by Freud, Jung, and others suggested that some knowledge might be forbidden not by external authorities, but by internal psychological mechanisms. The concept of repression implied that the mind itself might hide dangerous knowledge from conscious awareness. Jung's ideas about the collective unconscious suggested that some forms of knowledge might be too primal and powerful for conscious minds to handle safely. The digital age has created entirely new categories of forbidden knowledge, from computer viruses and hacking techniques to personal information that can be used for identity theft or social manipulation. The internet has made vast amounts of previously restricted information widely available, while also creating new forms of information that are considered too dangerous for general circulation. Contemporary discussions of forbidden knowledge often focus on biological and genetic information. The ability to manipulate genes, create new life forms, and potentially extend human lifespan raises questions about whether some forms of biological knowledge should be restricted. Unlike traditional forbidden knowledge narratives that focused on supernatural dangers, these contemporary concerns involve very real potential consequences for human health, social organization, and environmental stability. The persistence of forbidden knowledge narratives across cultures and throughout history suggests that they address fundamental aspects of human psychology and social organization. These stories help societies establish boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable forms of curiosity, provide frameworks for thinking about the relationship between knowledge and responsibility, and offer cautionary tales about the potential consequences of intellectual hubris. What makes the Necronomicon particularly effective as a forbidden knowledge narrative is how it combines traditional elements: ancient authorship, dangerous supernatural information, historical suppression, with modern concerns about cosmic insignificance and the limits of human understanding. Lovecraft's fictional grimoire feels authentic because it draws on genuine patterns that appear throughout human culture, while adapting them to contemporary anxieties about humanity's place in an indifferent universe. By the 1970s, demand for the Necronomicon had reached a point where entrepreneurial publishers began to see commercial opportunities in creating actual books to satisfy the market Lovecraft's fiction had created. This marked the beginning of one of publishing history's most unusual phenomena: the creation of multiple real versions of a book that had never existed, each claiming to be the authentic text that Lovecraft had only pretended to invent. The most famous and controversial of these publications appeared in 1977, published by Schlangekraft Inc., and edited by someone identified only as Simon. This version, which became known as the Simon Necronomicon, claimed to be based on ancient Sumerian sources that predated Lovecraft's fictional creation. The anonymous editor argued that Lovecraft had somehow gained access to genuine occult traditions and had incorporated real magical knowledge into his supposedly fictional stories. The Simon Necronomicon was a masterpiece of occult publishing, combining elements from genuine ancient texts with Lovecraftian mythology in ways that made the mixture seem historically plausible. The book included elaborate introduction materials explaining its supposed provenance, detailed instructions for magical rituals, and carefully crafted artwork that suggested ancient origins. The anonymous editorship added to the book's mystique. Simon claimed to be a scholar who had spent years researching the text's authenticity, but preferred to remain anonymous due to the dangerous nature of the material. What made the Simon Necronomicon particularly compelling was its synthesis of real historical sources with Lovecraftian fiction. The book drew heavily on genuine Mesopotamian mythology, incorporating actual Sumerian god names and ritual structures, while reinterpreting them through the lens of Lovecraft's cosmic horror. This approach suggested that Lovecraft's fiction was actually a modern rediscovery of ancient truths that mainstream archaeology and religion had either overlooked or deliberately suppressed. The book's publication created immediate controversy within both Lovecraft fan communities and genuine occult circles. Lovecraft scholars pointed out numerous anachronisms and impossibilities in the text's supposed history, while also noting that its contents bore little resemblance to the Necronomicon as described in Lovecraft's stories. However, many readers found these scholarly objections irrelevant. They were more interested in whether the book worked as a magical text than in its historical authenticity. The Simon Necronomicon became one of the best-selling occult books of the 1980s, inspiring countless practitioners to experiment with its rituals and incantations. The book's popularity was enhanced by its association with heavy metal music culture, particularly bands that incorporated Lovecraftian themes into their lyrics and imagery. Young people drawn to dark music and alternative spirituality found the book's combination of ancient wisdom and cosmic horror irresistibly appealing. Reports began circulating of people who had attempted the book's rituals and experienced unusual phenomena. Strange dreams, unexplained events, encounters with otherworldly entities. While skeptics dismissed these accounts as suggestion and imagination, the accumulation of such reports created a folklore around the book that enhanced its reputation as genuine magical literature. The line between psychological effect and supernatural occurrence became increasingly blurred as more people experimented with the text. Other publishers, seeing the success of the Simon Necronomicon, began producing their own versions of Lovecraft's fictional grimoire. Some claimed to be more accurate translations of ancient sources, while others presented themselves as reconstructions based on Lovecraft's scattered references throughout his stories. Each new version claimed authenticity, while implicitly or explicitly dismissing other versions as fraudulent or incomplete. The proliferation of different Necronomicons created a situation reminiscent of medieval manuscript traditions, where multiple versions of important texts circulated with varying degrees of authenticity and completeness. Serious practitioners began comparing different versions, attempting to determine which contained the most reliable magical information. This scholarly approach to obviously fictional texts demonstrated how completely the boundary between literature and occult practice had been erased. Academic responses to the various Necronomicon publications ranged from dismissive to fascinated. Some scholars ignored the phenomenon entirely, viewing it as beneath serious academic attention. Others became interested in the cultural and psychological factors that made fictional grimoires so appealing to contemporary readers. A few began serious study of how modern occult practices incorporated literary sources alongside traditional magical texts. The legal status of the various Necronomicon publications created interesting questions about copyright and intellectual property. Since Lovecraft's original works had entered public domain, publishers were free to create books inspired by his fictional references. However, some publishers claimed that their versions were based on sources that predated Lovecraft entirely, making copyright questions irrelevant. The result was a confusing marketplace where multiple books with the same title competed for readers' attention and money. International translations of the various Necronomicons spread the phenomenon to cultures unfamiliar with Lovecraft's original stories. In some cases, foreign publishers presented these books without adequate context about their fictional origins, leading readers to encounter them as genuine historical texts rather than modern creations inspired by literature. This cultural translation process further blurred the line between fiction and reality. The rise of the Internet in the 1990s created new platforms for Necronomicon distribution and discussion. Websites began offering free downloads of various versions, while online forums provided gathering places for practitioners to share experiences and compare different texts. The digital environment made it easier for people to encounter the Necronomicon, without the context that traditional bookstore browsing might have provided. Role-playing game communities played a crucial role in the Necronomicon's evolution from literary reference to practical text. Games like Call of Cthulhu encouraged players to treat Lovecraft's fictional texts as functional game elements, leading some players to experiment with these texts outside of gaming contexts. The boundary between entertainment and genuine occult practice became increasingly permeable as gaming communities developed sophisticated knowledge of Lovecraftian mythology. The commercialization of the Necronomicon phenomenon led to the production of numerous related materials. Tarot cards based on Lovecraftian themes, jewelry incorporating symbols from the various texts, artwork depicting scenes from the book's supposed contents. This merchandising created a complete consumer culture around a book that had never existed, demonstrating how thoroughly fictional creations can become integrated into material reality. By the 1990s, the various published Necronomicons had achieved sufficient cultural presence that they were being referenced in academic studies of contemporary occultism, analyzed in cultural criticism, and cited in discussions of postmodern literature. The books had become real cultural artifacts worthy of serious study, regardless of their fictional origins or questionable historical claims. The dawn of the Internet age transformed the Necronomicon from a primarily textual phenomenon into something far more multimedia and interactive. In the digital realm, Lovecraft's fictional grimoire found new forms of expression and new communities of believers, skeptics, and creative interpreters who pushed the boundaries between fiction and reality in ways that would have astonished even Lovecraft himself. Early bulletin board systems and Usenet groups in the 1980s and 1990s provided the first digital gathering places for Necronomicon enthusiasts. These text-based communities allowed people from around the world to share their experiences with various published versions of the book, compare notes on ritual practices, and debate questions of authenticity that would have been impossible to discuss in smaller, local groups. The anonymity of early internet culture encouraged people to share experiences they might never have discussed in person. The emergence of the World Wide Web in the 1990s created unprecedented opportunities for Necronomicon-related content. Websites began offering complete texts of various versions for free download, making the book more accessible than it had ever been in print form. Some sites presented these texts as historical curiosities, while others treated them as functional magical manuals complete with pronunciation guides and ritual instructions. Digital art communities embraced Lovecraftian themes with enthusiasm, creating visualizations of the Necronomicon's supposed contents that had never been possible in print media. Computer graphics allowed artists to create impossible geometries, shifting symbols, and otherworldly landscapes that seemed to embody the cosmic horror Lovecraft had described in words. These visual interpretations often became as influential as the textual versions, providing new ways for people to engage with the mythology. The rise of online gaming created immersive digital environments, where players could interact with virtual Necronomicons as functional objects within game worlds. Unlike traditional role-playing games where the book was primarily a storytelling device, digital games could simulate the experience of actually reading from ancient tomes, complete with visual effects, atmospheric sound design, and interactive elements that responded to player choices. Hypertext and early multimedia presentations allowed creators to develop nonlinear versions of the Necronomicon that changed based on reader interaction. These digital grimoires could present different content depending on how they were accessed, creating unique reading experiences that seemed to embody the book's supposed dangerous and unpredictable nature. Some presentations included timers, random elements, or user input requirements that made each encounter with the text feel personalized and potentially hazardous. The phenomenon of creepypasta, horror stories designed for internet sharing, provided new formats for Necronomicon-related content. These short, atmospheric narratives often featured contemporary characters encountering digital versions of the book through websites, email attachments, or other modern media. The stories blurred the line between fiction and reality by presenting themselves as personal accounts or discovered documents rather than formal literary works. Alternative reality games, ARGS, incorporated Necronomicon mythology into complex, multi-platform narratives that unfolded across websites, social media, phone systems, and sometimes even physical locations. These games encouraged participants to treat fictional elements as real investigative challenges, leading some players to develop genuine emotional investment in Lovecraftian mythology. The collaborative nature of ARGS meant that participants collectively contributed to evolving versions of the Necronomicon's digital mythology. File-sharing networks and peer-to-peer systems enabled rapid distribution of Necronomicon-related content, from scanned versions of rare published editions to original creations by amateur occultists and artists. This decentralized distribution system made it increasingly difficult to determine the provenance of particular versions, adding to the confusion about which texts were authentic and which were modern creations. Digital audio technology allowed for the creation of spoken versions of Necronomicon texts, complete with atmospheric sound effects and multiple voice actors. These audio presentations often proved more atmospheric and unsettling than text versions, especially when they incorporated unconventional vocal techniques to represent the alien languages supposedly contained in the original text. Some audio versions included subliminal elements or unusual frequency combinations that listeners claimed produced altered states of consciousness. The rise of social media platforms created new venues for Necronomicon-related communities to form and share content. Facebook groups, Reddit communities, and specialized forums provided spaces for enthusiasts to discuss their experiences, share artwork and creative interpretations, and debate various aspects of the book's mythology. These platforms also enabled rapid viral spread of Necronomicon-related memes and content. Mobile technology brought Necronomicon applications that could simulate the experience of carrying a digital grimoire in one's pocket. These apps often included interactive elements like randomized text generation, atmospheric background sounds, and augmented reality features that could overlay Lovecraftian imagery onto real-world environments through smartphone cameras. The convenience of mobile access made the Necronomicon available for casual browsing in ways that heavy printed versions never could. Video streaming platforms enabled the creation of dramatic readings, documentary-style presentations, and fictional narrative series based on Necronomicon themes. These productions often achieved production values that rivaled professional entertainment, while maintaining the grassroots authenticity that made them appealing to niche audiences. Some creators developed ongoing series that treated the Necronomicon as an ongoing investigative subject, rather than a finished topic. Artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies began being applied to generate new Necronomicon content automatically. These systems could analyze existing texts and create new passages in similar styles, leading to the production of endless variations on Lovecraftian themes. Some AI-generated content was indistinguishable from human-created material, raising new questions about authorship and authenticity in digital contexts. Virtual and augmented reality technologies promised even more immersive Necronomicon experiences, allowing users to virtually visit locations described in the book, or to interact with three-dimensional representations of its supposed contents. Early VR experiments created digital libraries where users could browse virtual grimoires and experience simulated magical rituals in ways that felt viscerally real despite their obvious artificial nature. The digital transformation of the Necronomicon demonstrated how internet culture could breathe new life into traditional mythologies, while also creating entirely new forms of cultural expression. The book's digital evolution showed how fictional creations could achieve genuine cultural influence through the simple mechanism of widespread sharing and creative reinterpretation across multiple platforms and communities. The cultural evolution of the Necronomicon created a fascinating division between two distinct communities. Academic scholars who studied it as a literary phenomenon and genuine occult practitioners who treated it as functional magical literature. This split reflected broader tensions between analytical distance and experiential engagement, between understanding cultural phenomena and participating in them. Literary scholars approaching the Necronomicon typically focused on its role within Lovecraft's broader artistic project and its place in the development of horror literature. These academics analyzed how Lovecraft's fictional bibliography created believable scholarly apparatus for impossible stories, examining the techniques he used to make his cosmic horror feel historically grounded. They studied the book's relationship to real occult traditions, tracing how Lovecraft incorporated elements from genuine grimoires while transforming them into something uniquely modern and unsettling. Academic conferences began featuring panels on Lovecraftian mythology, where scholars presented papers analyzing the cultural impact of fictional texts and the psychology of literary belief. These presentations often took place in university settings, where the Necronomicon's influence could be studied with analytical rigor, while maintaining clear distinctions between scholarly interest and personal belief. The academic approach emphasized historical context, literary influence, and cultural interpretation rather than practical application. Doctoral dissertations began examining the Necronomicon as a case study in how fictional texts could achieve cultural reality through reader investment and creative collaboration. These studies analyzed the social and psychological factors that made some fictional creations more culturally persistent than others, using the Necronomicon as an example of successful literary myth-making. Some scholars compared Lovecraft's creation to historical examples of fictional texts that had been mistaken for genuine documents. Literary criticism exploring the Necronomicon often focused on its reflection of modern anxieties about knowledge, authority, and cosmic insignificance. Scholars analyzed how the book embodied contemporary fears about scientific discovery, technological progress, and the erosion of traditional religious worldviews. These interpretations treated the Necronomicon as a cultural symptom rather than a historical artifact, using it to understand broader patterns in 20th century literature and society. Meanwhile, genuine occult practitioners developed entirely different relationships with the various published Necronomicons. For these communities, questions of historical authenticity were less important than practical effectiveness. Whether the books could facilitate genuine magical experiences, spiritual insights, or altered states of consciousness. Many practitioners treated the books as modern magical texts inspired by ancient traditions rather than literal historical documents. Occult bookshops began stocking multiple versions of the Necronomicon alongside traditional grimoires and magical texts, treating them as functional additions to magical libraries rather than historical curiosities. Shop owners often reported that customers approached these books with the same seriousness they brought to traditional magical texts, seeking guidance on ritual practice rather than literary analysis. Magical practitioners developed sophisticated approaches to working with obviously fictional magical texts, arguing that the symbolic and psychological content of these books could be as effective as historically authentic materials. Some practitioners claimed that the collective belief and creative energy invested in the Necronomicon had given it genuine magical potency regardless of its fictional origins. This perspective suggested that cultural belief could create functional magical systems independent of historical tradition. Experimental magical groups began developing practices specifically based on various Necronomicon versions, creating new traditions that combined Lovecraftian mythology with traditional magical techniques. These groups often emphasized the psychological and transformative aspects of magical practice rather than supernatural claims, treating the Necronomicon as a tool for exploring altered states of consciousness and confronting existential fears. The Internet enabled unprecedented communication between scholarly and occult communities interested in the Necronomicon, leading to complex dialogues between academic analysis and practical experimentation. Some scholars began participating in online discussions with practitioners, while some practitioners developed sophisticated historical and literary knowledge that rivaled academic expertise. These interactions created hybrid approaches that combined scholarly rigor with experiential exploration. Conference presentations began featuring both academic papers and practitioner reports, creating unusual academic environments where analytical and experiential approaches were presented side by side. These events highlighted the different epistemological frameworks used by scholars and practitioners. Academics emphasizing verifiable evidence and logical analysis, practitioners prioritizing personal experience and practical results. Some scholars began conducting ethnographic studies of Necronomicon practicing communities, treating contemporary occult groups as valid subjects for anthropological investigation. These studies examined how modern practitioners adapted fictional materials for genuine spiritual purposes, providing insights into the relationship between literature, belief, and religious practice in contemporary culture. Graduate students occasionally found themselves caught between academic training that emphasized critical distance and personal interests in practical experimentation with the texts they were studying. Some developed innovative research methodologies that combined scholarly analysis with personal exploration, though such approaches often created tensions with traditional academic expectations about objectivity and professional boundaries. The emergence of chaos magic traditions provided theoretical frameworks for practitioners who wanted to work with obviously fictional magical systems, while maintaining intellectual honesty about their origins. Chaos magic emphasized pragmatic effectiveness over historical authenticity, allowing practitioners to treat the Necronomicon as a valid magical tool without claiming ancient origins or supernatural authority. Publishers began producing academic editions of various Necronomicon versions that included scholarly apparatus. Introductions explaining the text's fictional origins, footnotes identifying literary and historical sources, and appendices comparing different versions. These academic editions allowed serious study, while maintaining clear distinctions between scholarly interest and religious practice. The relationship between literary scholars and occult practitioners studying the Necronomicon demonstrated how the same cultural artifact could serve entirely different functions for different communities. While scholars used the book to understand literature, psychology, and cultural phenomena, practitioners used it for personal transformation, spiritual exploration, and magical practice. Both approaches contributed to the book's ongoing cultural evolution and demonstrated the complex ways that fictional creations could achieve genuine cultural significance. As we reach the end of our journey through the strange cultural life of the Necronomicon, we find ourselves contemplating one of the most remarkable phenomena in literary history: how a book that never existed became more real than many books that actually do exist. In libraries around the world, librarians still field regular requests for this fictional tome. In occult shops, multiple authentic versions compete for readers' attention. In online communities, enthusiasts continue to debate its contents, authenticity, and proper interpretation. The Necronomicon has achieved a form of cultural immortality that most real books never attain. The secret of the Necronomicon's enduring power lies not in its non-existent pages, but in what it represents about fundamental human drives and fears. Lovecraft's fictional grimoire perfectly embodies our species' complex relationship with knowledge, our insatiable curiosity balanced against our deep anxiety about what we might discover. The book promises answers to ultimate questions, while simultaneously warning that some answers are too terrible for human minds to bear. This tension between desire and dread, between seeking and fearing, resonates across cultural boundaries and historical periods. What makes the Necronomicon particularly compelling in our contemporary moment is how it addresses modern anxieties about humanity's place in the universe. Traditional religious worldviews placed humans at the center of cosmic purpose, but scientific discoveries of the past few centuries have consistently revealed our cosmic insignificance. The Necronomicon offers a mythology that acknowledges this insignificance, while transforming it into a source of dark wonder rather than simple despair. The book's fictional history also speaks to contemporary concerns about lost knowledge and hidden truth. In an age of information overload, where vast amounts of data compete for our attention, the idea of ancient, suppressed wisdom holds special appeal. The Necronomicon suggests that the most important knowledge isn't widely available through Google searches or university courses, but remains hidden in rare manuscripts accessible only to the most dedicated seekers. Perhaps most importantly, the Necronomicon phenomenon demonstrates the power of collaborative creativity and shared imagination. Lovecraft created the initial concept, but the book's cultural reality has been built through the contributions of countless readers, writers, artists, publishers, and practitioners who have added their own interpretations and extensions to the original mythology. This collective creative process mirrors how all cultural meanings are constructed. Through ongoing dialogue between creators and audiences, between individual imagination and shared belief. The various published versions of the Necronomicon represent something genuinely new in human culture. Books that claim to be historical artifacts, while openly acknowledging their fictional inspiration. These texts exist in a unique category that transcends traditional distinctions between fiction and nonfiction, between historical document and creative work. They demonstrate how contemporary culture can create new forms of meaning that don't fit into established categories. The internet age has accelerated and complicated the Necronomicon's cultural evolution, creating digital environments where fictional and real, historical and contemporary, can blend in unprecedented ways. Online communities treat the book with varying degrees of literal belief, metaphorical interpretation, and creative play, often simultaneously. This multiplicity of approaches suggests that the book's meaning isn't fixed or determined by authorial intention, but rather emerges from ongoing cultural negotiation. The scholarly study of the Necronomicon has revealed important insights about how fictional creations can acquire cultural reality through reader investment and creative elaboration. These insights have implications for understanding other cultural phenomena. From urban legends and conspiracy theories to religious traditions and historical narratives, the book serves as a case study in how human beings create meaning through storytelling, and how those stories can develop lives of their own. The continuing appeal of forbidden knowledge narratives in contemporary culture suggests that the Necronomicon phenomenon addresses enduring human needs that aren't satisfied by conventional education or mainstream entertainment. People seem to crave stories that acknowledge the limitations of human understanding, while suggesting that greater knowledge remains accessible to those willing to seek it, despite the risks involved. The global spread of Necronomicon-related culture demonstrates how modern communication technologies can create shared mythologies that transcend national and cultural boundaries. Young people in diverse cultural contexts have found common ground in Lovecraftian imagery and themes, suggesting that some forms of imaginative content can achieve universal appeal despite their specific cultural origins. The commercial success of various Necronomicon publications reflects broader trends in contemporary publishing and entertainment, where franchise properties and shared universes generate ongoing revenue through multiple media formats and creative extensions. The book has become a brand that continues to inspire new creative works decades after its original fictional creation. Looking toward the future, the Necronomicon seems likely to continue evolving as new technologies create new possibilities for interactive and immersive engagement with fictional content. Virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and other emerging technologies may create forms of Necronomicon experience that approach the transformative power that the fictional book is supposed to possess. Ultimately, the Necronomicon's greatest achievement may be its demonstration that imagination can be more powerful than reality, that human creativity can produce cultural artifacts that outlast their creators and influence generations of readers, writers, and believers. In a world increasingly dominated by data and algorithms, the book reminds us that mystery, wonder, and the unknown remain essential parts of human experience. The Necronomicon exists because we need it to exist. It represents our dreams of hidden knowledge, our fears of cosmic insignificance, our desire for transformation, and our recognition that some of life's most important experiences can't be quantified or explained. In the end, perhaps the most profound truth about this fictional book is that its non-existence makes it more powerful, not less. Free from the limitations of actual content, it can be whatever each reader needs it to be. Tonight, we've wandered together through the labyrinthine story of literature's most famous book that never was. From its birth in the fevered imagination of a reclusive writer in Providence to its transformation into a global cultural phenomenon that spans academic conferences and occult bookshops, scholarly dissertations, and magical rituals. We've discovered how a work of pure fiction could become so convincing that it escaped the boundaries of literature to become a living part of contemporary culture, inspiring genuine belief, serious scholarship, and creative elaboration that continues to this day. The Necronomicon's journey from Lovecraft's fictional references to multiple published versions, digital manifestations, and ongoing cultural influence demonstrates something profound about the power of human imagination and the complex ways that stories can shape reality. In following this evolution, we've glimpsed the deeper currents that flow beneath all cultural creation. Our eternal fascination with forbidden knowledge, our complex relationship with the unknown, and our ability to collectively bring imaginary things into functional existence through shared belief and creative collaboration. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the strange and wonderful cultural life of the book that never was, yet somehow always is. If you're already drifting off, then our mission is complete. But if you're still awake, perhaps another deep dive through forbidden libraries and forgotten lore will carry you gently into slumber. Until we meet again in these quiet hours, may your dreams be filled with ancient wisdom and cosmic wonder. And may you always remember that the most powerful books are sometimes the ones that exist only in imagination, where their influence can never be contained by mere physical pages.